I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a video for my Law and Economics seminar about property law and what we call the Tiebout model. Now, for my students, this is a famous theory from political science and economics. Tiebout was an economist, and it has generated an enormous academic literature. And so you may have encountered this in a local land use course, or maybe even in your property course. And we're going to be looking at it a little bit from a law and economics perspective here. The other thing I want to say is you will hear this name pronounced differently by different people. And for this video, I went ahead and found out how the originator of this theory, who it's named after, pronounced his own name. So I'm going to call him Tiebout, because that's how he said his name according to his close friends. And sort of like right now there's a recently retired professional football player with a similar sounding last name. So let's talk about the Tiebout model, or the Tiebout theory here. So and sometimes you'll hear people call it Tieboutian or Tieboutian theory, but basically the general gist here, for don't give up on me yet, is that localities compete to attract businesses and residents and institutions. And so cities want to grow. They don't want to usually decline and have lots of empty businesses and buildings boarded up and things like that. And so the question then for my students is, think about, how can a locale attract businesses to move in and homeowners? And also ask yourself if these two things are sometimes mutually exclusive. So if you're doing everything you can to be business friendly, does that make it less desirable for people to live there? Now, of course, a business is going to need workers, and they're going to have to live somewhere nearby, but it may be that your town or your locale is so business friendly that everybody basically lives in another area that's more set up for residences and then commutes into work. So it's worth asking yourself at the outset if businesses and residents are sometimes in tension with each other, and so you have to target one or the other. Now, the Tiebout model, which is sometimes called Tiebout sorting or Tiebout migration or the Tiebout hypothesis, originated back in 1956 with an article by an economist named Charles Tiebout, entitled A Pure Theory of Local Expenditures. And he suggested that competition between local jurisdictions places competitive pressures for them to provide local public goods, which in the end will yield optimal levels of public goods, because people will move to places where they get the goods that are of the greatest value to them. So his model, Tiebout's model, implies that there's a non-political market solution to the free rider problem in local governance. In other words, the population will eventually sort itself into optimal or optimized communities along the lines of the residents' shared preferences. In other words, again, to explain the model, the idea is that if, let's say, municipalities like a city like Houston or Los Angeles or Chicago offer varying baskets of goods. And so these could be government services. What are we talking about? Roads, city sewer, city water provision, trash pickup, public parks, good schools. That's a really big one. Great public schools, law enforcement, and so forth. Well-managed traffic stops and traffic lights and things like that. And they offer these at a variety of prices or different tax rates. Then people who have different personal valuations for these services and prices will move from one local community to another that maximizes their personal utility. I'll give you a very simple example that my students can probably identify with. When you're young and single, you might kind of prefer apartment living and like living downtown where there's a nice little nightlife. You don't need a lot of space and so forth. But when people start to have families and they want to they get married and have children, a lot of times they need more space and they want maybe a backyard with a swing set and things like that. And so these are two different types of people, and right, that kind of want a very different type of community to live in. One wants apartments where there's lots of fun things to do in the evenings and weekends, and it's easy to get around. Maybe it's easy to live without a car, and you have great public transportation and so on. And the other person wants a place where it's a safe community, and there's good schools, and there's nice houses that are affordable. And as I said, they have yards and sidewalks, and there's nice big grocery stores, and maybe a mall nearby and things like that. And so they're looking for different things. And the idea is that these two different types of environments people want to live in are offered by a kind of created by municipalities that offer them as what Tiebout would have called baskets of goods. So how do we get there? Well, everybody wants to grow, right? That's the idea here. Municipalities can choose between two basic strategies to attract more people to their community. And in one, the regional municipalities can kind of act as a cartel, enforcing a singular tax rate and similar services. In other words, you could have a large metropolitan area where all the suburbs around a big city basically have the same kind of similar schools and similar houses and similar property tax levels. And they're basically acting in concert or coordinating their activities with each other so that they don't have to compete. And everybody is kind of stuck in that area unless you want to move to another part of the country. And the second strategy is the opposite, is to have a competition, like in terms of taxes. So somebody's offering lower property taxes to attract people to move in, or try to offer higher services. Note that you probably can't have it both ways. You can't lower taxes and raise the stuff that you give people, right? And so, but there are people who would rather have low property taxes, and then they don't mind potholes in the roads and crummy schools, and they've never seen the local cop cars, no traffic patrols or anything like that. But the idea is that eventually, if they are in competition, they will converge around an average. And so this is one of the kind of implications of Tiebout's model, is that municipalities that are competing, eventually the market will sort out, and then they're going to kind of hover around something that's the average property tax and property value and typical services. Now, there's some assumptions here, and I want my students to understand that all of these are sort of common sense, but also very debatable. So Tiebout assumes for his model that people can easily move and are free to choose where they live, and that they're aware of different tax rates and so forth. So when you have somebody who's trying to decide, let's say you get your first job after law school, you're moving to a new metropolitan area, and so when you're driving around to different suburbs on the north, south, east, and west side of town, either you look up online, or your real estate agent gives you information about what the tax rates are and so forth. And Tiebout assumes that you can live wherever you want. And I hope you can see that that's not exactly true. A lot of us are kind of stuck to family or our job, or a mortgage that we're over leveraged in, or something like that. He also assumed that there's a lot of communities from which to choose. And again, if you live in Wyoming, that might not be true. But if you live on the East Coast, somewhere between, let's say, Boston and Washington, D.C., there's a lot of communities to choose from. And so if you don't like it where you live, you could move 2 towns over, or 3 towns over, or 4 towns over, and so forth. In some ways, Tiebout's assumptions are the exact opposite of if in constitutional law or First Amendment, you learned about the factory town or the mill town, where there is one place to live, and everybody has the same employer. Tiebout also assumed that there would be no spillover benefits or costs or externalities between adjacent communities. So I want you to imagine a nice affluent community with nice expensive homes and yards, and people have swimming pools in their backyard, great schools, but they're sandwiched between two really poor communities that have housing developments and high crime rates, bad schools, and so forth. And the fact is that there could be some negative externalities if you're sandwiched between two poor communities with high crime. Some of that may spill over at the edges, or people may come. You might have higher crime for the affluent community that's adjacent to a high crime, poor neighborhood or something like that. And then there's also positive externalities, right? So the affluent community may have a really nice shopping mall, or nice parks and stuff like that, that people from areas a few miles away that are living, are more deprived, less privileged, may kind of come in as guests or visitors and try to enjoy some of those benefits. So or if you have an affluent community that really decides to clean up the crime in their community and they have the money to do it, there will probably be spillover effects for the neighboring communities as well. And Tiebout assumed that there wouldn't be for his model, at least as a theoretical model. Now, he also assumes that communities are rational and try to keep the public bad consumers away. And what are we talking about here? People, homeless people that sleep on the street, or organized crime, or people that are going to set up a business that generates a lot of pollution and trash, and or is a lot of noise, or bad odors, like a paper mill. Those smell terrible. A trash incineration facility. And so communities don't want those. They don't want the state prison in their community, for example, and so on. He also assumed that differences in the physical attractiveness of a town will be reflected in the home prices. And I really want my students to grasp this. So in your first year property course, you learned a lot about the different types of ownership you can have in the bundle of rights, and how that can be transferred, how we record titles and deeds and property. You learned about things like adverse possession and so forth. But now I want you to think about the prices of homes and what goes into a home's price. Why does a home cost as much as it does? And he says it's partly the differences in the fiscal attractiveness, sort of the algorithm of its the costs, the taxes, property taxes, and then the benefits of living there. And so the price of any home reflects these costs, including local property taxes, and then the benefits, including local public goods, like the quality of the local public schools for there. And so there's a correlation. Now let's talk about the implications of Tiebout. Those were his assumptions, and each one is a little problematic, but also useful as a theoretical model or a thought experiment. Now, let's talk about some of the implications. One is the correlation of taxes and benefits. So public goods like good roads, a nice wide main street and sidewalks, and schools and things like that, that mostly benefit the local community, should be provided locally. Why? Well, according to Tiebout, so that people who really want good schools and a cute little downtown district where they can spend Saturday afternoon wandering through boutique shops and little miniature craft shops and stuff like that, artisan coffee shops, and on and on. If you like that, then you can move there and live there. And if you don't, if you really want to live sandwiched between lumber mills and hardware stores, then you can move somewhere else. And so he was saying that there's certain things that really benefit the local people, and the local government should provide those things. And conversely, there's certain public goods like social services for the poor that the locality has a perverse incentive not to provide, right? So when I moved, one of the last places I lived before I moved to the Houston area was Hartford, Connecticut. And the mayor in the 90s or early 2000s had announced that they were not going to give permits to any more charities like soup kitchens and homeless shelters that basically helped the homeless, because he felt like the city had become a magnet for homeless people. And so there was basically, he was trying to discourage the provision of services for the poor. And Tibu would not be surprised about this at all. He would think that lots of municipalities would like to shift their poor population and criminals and homeless people and things like that, people who struggle with addiction, to neighboring towns, and that so that they could have productive taxpayers and shoppers and customers and workers in their town. And so he argued that these types of things are better provided by the state or federal government that addresses a wide range of communities. Conversely, there are some public goods with really significant positive externalities, large spillover effects, that are also underprovided. And so if you think about it, there are certain things that your town could might do that benefit the locals, but also equally benefit people who live in the next town over in all the surrounding towns. It's a really, really great public good or public service, and that you've provided like a wonderful parkland or something like that, or great shopping opportunities and so on. And because the other towns are not getting, not having to pay for it, but they get the benefits, there's a free rider problem. And so, kind of counterintuitively, sometimes towns don't want to invest in something that everybody wants. Why? Because they feel like the neighboring towns would free ride on that, would get to use it too without having to pay for it. And so they're basically footing the bill for this public good, whatever it is, and not getting all of the reaping all of the benefits. Some of the benefits go outside the community. And so in those types of cases, the federal and state government also should promote this or encourage it to either take it over or promote it through local investment through grants. There's also an issue with economies of scale. Some public goods you can achieve significant economies of scale. And by economies of scale, we mean it's cheaper per unit when it's done on a large scale. So usually we talk about economies of scale with a factory. So let's say you're producing widgets in your factory, and you are making widgets in your little workshop in your garage, let's say. And that's all well and good. And so you have a certain cost per widget that you can produce. Well, it turns out if you had a gigantic factory with 100,000 square feet and lots of machinery and stuff like that, that you could produce a lot more widgets and for less per unit. It's sort of like because you could buy your raw materials in bulk, and you could have better machinery or more efficient machinery and so forth. And there are public goods, things that governments provide. So again, schools, roads, and so forth, that actually have features of economies of scale. And the classic example is national defense, right? So we don't want to have 50 little state armies. That's really much less efficient than having one national Air Force, national Navy, national Army, and so forth. And same is true with our international border control. And sometimes also with centralized public health agencies like the CDC or the National Institute of Health, or the Food and Drug Administration, where we can really get economies of scale if we do it, if we centralize it and do it on a national level. And Tiebout said local jurisdictions just don't provide these efficiently. You know what the local jurisdictions are really good at? Running a local library or running a local elementary school, having a little city park with swing sets and a playscape for kids, or a public swimming pool, swimming hole, and things like that. They're really bad at having their own army or issuing their own currency, or regulating their own banks and things like that. So some of that should be done on the state or national level. Now, I want to talk briefly, and I promise I'm almost done, about SALT tax implications. Note, in light of what we've been talking about with Tiebout and municipalities and even states competing with each other to attract businesses and productive workers to move there, that there could be significant implications of federal tax exemptions. So for many years, you could take a tax exemption, a pretty hefty tax exemption on your federal taxes for any state or local taxes you provided. And this basically rewarded states that had local taxes and then provided more public goods and services for their people. And then this recently ended, right? So now instead of that kind of getting this benefit, a deduction on your federal taxes, you don't. And so keep that in mind, that there are significant implications, and you could do a paper on this even, about the implications for sort of the Tiebout model of competition between states and municipalities, if we're going to have a federal tax exemption for state and local taxes, or SALT taxes is the acronym. Also note that Tiebout's competition can lead to not only a competition to provide better goods, better public goods, better roads, better schools, but also a race to the bottom for jurisdictions in terms of their laws and wanting to have business-friendly laws, like we'll look the other way if you pollute or violate other types of regulations and laws, because they want to attract businesses. And this also can create an argument for having centralized regulation and enforcement on the federal level if we have a problem with states basically having states or cities having a race to the bottom for certain things. And that concludes my lecture about the Tiebout model and property law and economics.